So hello everyone. We will start our talk in a few minutes. So I'm Fernanda. I will be mediating this seminar. So this is our first international seminar from the graduate program in ecology from the Federal University of Rio Grande do Sul. I'm really happy to be here announcing this. So we will have monthly online seminars, always on a Thursday, once per month. And we have today our first guest. The proposal of these seminars is to invite researchers that we collaborate with and that we admire as well, to bring them here and for a presentation and to discuss a bit their research and exchange some ideas. So today we have Dr. Lenore Fahrig here. She is a landscape ecologist and conservation biologist from Carleton University in Canada. I'm really happy that she accepted to be here. It's an honor. She's dedicated a lot of her work to discuss and show evidence of some issues in landscape ecology and conservation biology that are usually known to, like, thought to be established, and she digs the evidence and brings this to discussion for us. So today we'll have one of these opportunities to discuss with her, and I'm really happy to announce that. So I will start here. I will remove my camera, and then I will leave her with her presentation. You can write, so we are on live on YouTube on the graduate program channel. You can make questions there, and we will answer here through the broadcast. So we are seeing the questions from YouTube. And if you want to write your question in Portuguese, there's no problem. We'll translate and have the discussion here. Okay, so I will remove myself for a while. And before that, I just wanted to thank Lenore for accepting our invitation. And it's an honor to have you as our first guest.
Thank you. Thank you, Fernanda. So do I click on my presentation?
Yeah, I will include your presentation here, and then you can put full screen, and then I will remove myself.
Okay. Okay, so is that working? Can you just confirm, Fernanda? Oh.
Yes, it's working. So okay, if you need anything, I will be here. Then I will just add myself.
Okay, great. Okay, good. Thanks.
If you have any problem, I will also interrupt you.
Okay, thanks. Right, so the only thing I can see is my screen, my presentation, just so the rest of you know. Thank you very much, Fernanda, for the invitation and for the introduction, and thanks to all of you for coming to this talk. So this is the title of my talk. I just want to move to the second slide, which shows a Google Earth image from Southern Ontario, a portion of Southern Ontario, which is in the south of Canada. So this is a region that has a very high intensity of human impact. So over on the right-hand side, you can see the city of Toronto, or a portion of the city of Toronto. And there are some other towns. And then the rest of the region is mostly agriculture, high intensity agriculture. with some of the some forest, maybe 10 or 15% forest. A few hundred years ago, this would have been almost all forest cover, and now it's almost all crop fields, agriculture. So if we zoom in and look at a landscape, this is what it looks like. So we have small patches of forest surrounded by intensive agriculture. And so it's not hard to understand or infer that the persistence of the forest species, so this being the natural habitat in this region, that the persistence of the forest species in this landscape must be dependent on their ability to move between these small patches of forest. So you might have a harsh winter, and a population in a small patch might disappear, and then for that patch to be recolonized, animals or plants have to be able to move from other patches that are still containing the population. So this idea is, and this type of landscape is what led to the metapopulation concept. So the metapopulation concept, now the patches, I'm showing the patches in green, circles, and the circles that are full indicate where there is a population present, and the ones that are open circles indicate the population is absent. And so the metapopulation concept, it suggests that the persistence of a population in a set of patches depends on a balance between extinctions of local populations in patches and colonizations of those patches. So through time, you have patches blinking out, going extinct, and other patches that were empty becoming recolonized over time. And so you have, if the metapopulation is stable, then you have approximately the same number of patches occupied through time, but the which ones are occupied and which ones are empty changes through time. So that's the metapopulation concept. And the importance of colonization in this concept has led to certain expectations in ecology and conservation biology. The first one, I'm going to talk about three of them. The first one is that weak dispersers are thought to be generally more sensitive to land use intensification than strong dispersers. The second is that fragmentation of habitat, independent of habitat loss, reduces biodiversity. And the third is that habitat fragmentation by roads strongly impacts wildlife populations. So in the rest of this talk, I'm going to talk about each of these. I'll give some evidence that this is, in fact, the expectation that most people have, or most researchers have. And then I'll also talk about the evidence for that actual expectation. And then at the end, I'll talk about the implications first of all, for conservation decision-making. And then at the very end, I'll talk about the implications for our understanding of the role of dispersal in conservation. So first, the expectation that weak dispersers are generally more sensitive to land use intensification than strong dispersers. So here I've put the same figure that I had before, but I've made the background or the matrix part of the landscape gray to indicate intensive land use. So if you have a strong disperser, the idea is that if you have a strong disperser, then it will be able to recolonize those local extinctions, and you'll end up with a stable metapopulation. But if you have a weak disperser, meaning if the species doesn't disperse very far, or if it doesn't produce very many dispersers, there are not very many dispersers leaving patches, then what can happen is that with land use intensification, the possibility of recolonization of these local extinctions drops. And so over time, you can have an accumulation of local extinctions. So the idea is that because of the need for colonization, you have a prediction that strong dispersers will be less sensitive to land use intensification than weak dispersers. So a former postdoc in my lab, Amanda Martin, did a review on this topic. So she did she searched for papers that combined, so any kind of taxon, and then for that taxon, had the dispersal ability and the effect of land use intensification on the taxa. There had to be multiple taxa in the study, because she was looking for the effect of dispersal ability, so different levels of dispersal ability on the response of the different taxa to land use intensification. So dispersal ability is most authors don't actually directly measure disperser, but they index dispersal ability in various ways. So the most common way to index dispersal ability is some kind of morphological measure. So for plants, the height of the plants, or for animals, the body size, or the presence or absence or shape of wings, etc. And then other things like the length of the dispersal period in time, the range size of the species, whether it's phylopatric or not, and then in some cases, actual dispersal distance, and some cases just expert opinion, and so on. So there are, and I've not put all of the different ways that people index dispersal ability. So what Amanda was looking for is essentially the interaction effect. So the effect of dispersal ability on the effect of land use intensification on occurrence or abundance of different taxa. So she divided the results from the papers into two possibilities, depending on the sign of the interaction. So either weak dispersers are more sensitive to land use intensification than strong dispersers, or strong dispersers are more sensitive to land use intensification than weak dispersers. So to illustrate that, so we have dispersal ability from strong to weak. So the strong disperser is blue and the weak disperser is in yellow. So if weak dispersers are more sensitive to land use intensification, then the slope of the relationship between land use intensification and abundance or occurrence of the species should be steeper for the weak disperser than for the strong disperser. On the other hand, if strong dispersers are more sensitive to land use intensification, then the slope of the relationship between land use intensification and abundance or occurrence of the species should be steeper for the strong disperser than for the weak disperser. So she's looking for this interaction effect, the direction of this interaction effect. Of the 150 articles, just over half of them made an a priori prediction about what they expected to find. And of those, 88% predicted that weak dispersers would be more sensitive to land use intensification than strong dispersers. So this confirms, this is evidence for my initial statement that there is an expectation out there that weak dispersers should be more sensitive to land use intensification. However, if we look at the studies, it's much more even. So there are more studies finding at least one case where weak dispersers are more sensitive than studies finding at least one case where strong dispersers are more sensitive. But there are lots of cases of findings where strong dispersers are more sensitive to land use intensification than weak dispersers. These don't add up to 100% because these are the number of papers, and many papers have more than one finding in them. So the other thing that Amanda did is she looked at what the results are depending on whether the authors made a prediction about weak dispersers being more sensitive to land use intensification. So if the authors predicted in the introduction, or expected, that weak dispersers would be more sensitive to land use intensification than strong dispersers. In most of those cases, they actually found that result. So 78% of the time, they found that weak dispersers were more sensitive. But when authors did not make that prediction, so they had no expectation for the authors that made no prediction in the introduction. The findings were 50-50. So half the time, weak dispersers were more sensitive, and half the time, strong dispersers were more sensitive to land use intensification. So it's possible that this is evidence of a publication bias, where the authors who predict that weak dispersers are going to be more sensitive to intensification than strong dispersers are more likely to maybe discount any results they get that go counter to that. So considering those results to be less reliable, for example, or it might not be the authors, it might be the reviewers. But there does seem to be the possibility, at least, that there's some publication bias. The other thing that Amanda did is she looked at the results as stated in the abstract versus the actual results that people found. So all of the results showing that weak dispersers were more sensitive than strong dispersers to land use intensification, most of them, so 2/3 of them, of those cases, the authors included that result in the abstract. Whereas when authors found that strong dispersers were more sensitive to land use intensification, only 1/3 of the time did they actually include that result in their abstract. So again, especially as a lot of people often don't read beyond the abstract, this will bias the impression of the results that are out there. So giving the impression that the result that weak dispersers are more sensitive is more prevalent than it actually is in the literature. Okay, so despite the expectation that weak dispersers are more sensitive, the evidence actually shows that strong dispersers are often more sensitive to land use intensification. There are more cases where weak dispersers are more sensitive, but if you consider that there are seem to be some biases in reporting, possibly, it could even be almost 50-50. Half the time, weak dispersers are more sensitive, and half the time, strong dispersers are more sensitive. So why is that? I think the reason probably relates to the fact that dispersal ability it has different aspects to it, has multiple aspects, and which can produce opposite effects. So if we go back to this list of different ways that people have measured or indexed dispersal ability, some of them are really indexing dispersal distance, and others are indexing dispersal rate. So the likelihood of individuals leaving habitat patches. And some of them are actually somehow combining the two, or it's hard to tell which one of them would be more strongly related to the index. And I think the thing is that these two aspects of dispersal ability produce different predictions in terms of response to land use intensification. So if we consider dispersal distance, the higher the dispersal distance, the farther the organism can travel, then the more likely patches will be colonized, or there will be immigrants to a patch. So that should lead to a positive effect of dispersal ability on species response to land use intensification. However, if dispersal ability is really about the dispersal rate, so how many individuals leave habitat, then you have an increase in mortality. So there are some dispersers that won't make it to another patch, and they will die. And so dispersal increases the overall mortality rate in the landscape. So the more individuals that leave patches, the more individuals that die. without making it, because only a subset of them will make it to other habitat. So the overall mortality rate on the population increases. So that's actually a negative effect of dispersal ability on the response of a species to land use intensification. So we have this kind of two-edged sword, and I think that's probably the reason why we have both directions of effect. But whatever the explanation, the evidence is not strong that weak dispersers are generally more sensitive to land use intensification than strong dispersers. It's definitely not as strong. The evidence is definitely not as strong as the expectation is. That 88% expectation is much, much higher than the actual proportion. Okay, so the second expectation is that fragmentation of habitat independent of habitat loss reduces biodiversity. So what is habitat fragmentation independent of habitat loss? If we consider this area of habitat, we can reduce that area of habitat, but keep it in one patch, in which case we have the loss of habitat, but no fragmentation of habitat. Or we could remove the same amount of habitat and leave multiple patches, either a small number of patches, of larger patches, or a large number of smaller patches. In that case, we have both habitat loss and habitat fragmentation. And so if we consider this gradient across the bottom, so it's like the resulting pattern that we get after the process of habitat loss, we can have a gradient in habitat fragmentation independent of habitat loss. So we have the same amount of habitat, but different numbers of patches and sizes of patches, creating a gradient in habitat fragmentation. So that's habitat fragmentation independent of habitat loss. Going back to 1975, Jared Diamond predicted that a single large reserve or patch should hold more species than several small reserves of the same total area. So this is his figure from his paper. And on the left-hand side, he had better for biodiversity. On the right-hand side, he has worse for biodiversity. And his item B in this figure shows the same amount of habitat on the left and the right, but on the right, it's fragmented, and that he considered to be worse for biodiversity. So that was his expectation. And his arguments were essentially very similar to the arguments behind the metapopulation concept. So the idea was that if you have the same amount of habitat, but it's in several small patches, then each of those patches has a higher probability of extinction than the one large patch. And to maintain the overall population in those four patches, you have to rely on the process of recolonization and immigration from the other patches, which is always a little bit uncertain through the landscape. And so at any one time, we would have a lower population across those four patches because some of them might have recently gone extinct, which again would reduce the overall chance of survival of the population among the four smaller patches compared to the one big patch. So a few years ago, I did a study looking at this, what is the evidence for this? So I looked for papers that specifically measured fragmentation independent of habitat loss. So I included only studies where fragmentation was estimated independent of habitat amount, and I looked for any system, any kind of habitat, any taxon where that was the case. So the responses were mostly individual species responses, mostly abundance or presence of individual species. There was also quite a few responses that were species richness, and then a small number of other responses, population growth rate, movement success or movement range, and a few water quality responses. But mostly it was abundance or presence of individual species. So what I found was that I estimated that about 70% of effects of fragmentation, independent of habitat amount, are not significant. And of the ones that are significant, about 3/4 of them were positive. So increasing abundance or occurrence of the species and increasing the number of species with increasing fragmentation. So this just shows many of the species and species groups for which positive effects of fragmentation have been documented. So you can see that there's a wide range of different taxa, and there's also a wide range of different systems. So I'll just let you look at that for a few more seconds. So yes, like I said, it's quite diverse, the set of species and species groups. And importantly, within the set of studies that I found, the individuals for individual species, at least, most of the significant fragmentation effects were positive, even for the species that are declining or threatened. So just to look at the expectation, I did the same thing that Amanda had done with dispersal ability, her review on dispersal ability. So I divided the studies into those that found only negative effects of fragmentation, those that found only positive effects of fragmentation, and those that found both directions. So some of their results showed negative effects and some of their results showed positive effects. So that's from the actual data in their studies. And then I looked at how they represented these results in the abstracts of the study. So did they represent the results as negative fragmentation effects, positive fragmentation effects, neutral or mixed effects, or did they ignore the fragmentation effects altogether? So the few studies that found only negative fragmentation effects, most of those studies included that in the abstract, that result in the abstract as negative fragmentation effects. The studies that found some negative and some positive fragmentation effects, mostly in the abstracts, they did represent their results as showing neutral or mixed effects of fragmentation. But the studies that found only positive fragmentation effects, and this was the majority of the studies, only 40% of those represented their results as positive fragmentation effects in the abstract. Most of them either represented them as neutral or mixed responses, or they ignored the fragmentation effects altogether. So this suggests that even the authors that look at the separate effects of habitat fragmentation separate from habitat loss. So they are focused on this, the importance of looking at this separate effect of fragmentation. Nevertheless, either they or the reviewers or the editors are reluctant to highlight those results in the abstracts, which again suggests that those results are going against the general expectation. So, but overall then, this review suggests that this extrapolation from the metapopulation concept to the idea that fragmentation independent of habitat loss has generally negative effects is not a valid extrapolation. So what is happening here? There are a few possible explanations for why we could find positive effects of fragmentation on species. But in the context of dispersal, which is what I'm talking about today, I think that there is a possible explanation that is essentially the same as the explanation for why dispersal ability can have both positive and negative effects on a species' ability to respond to land use intensification. So if we, to understand that, consider that we have two landscapes that have the same amount of habitat. The one on the left has few patches and the one on the right has many patches. So the one on the right is more fragmented than the one on the left. So there are two important differences between these sets of patches. When you have a less fragmented landscape or a set of habitat, then there is actually less edge, habitat edge, and more fragmented means more edge. But also it means that the patches, when they're more fragmented, are actually closer together. So if you take a given area and you randomly put in there a small number of large patches versus a large number of small patches, then the small patches, the distances, patch to patch distances, are going to be smaller among the large number of small patches than the small number of large patches. So the difference in edge is important because it relates to the dispersal rate. So the number of individuals or the likelihood of individuals leaving habitat. So the dispersal rate will be lower in the less fragmented landscape than in the more fragmented landscape, just because there is less edge in the less fragmented landscape. And what this means is that the opportunity for dispersal mortality, the number of individuals dying and not making it to another patch, should be higher where you have a more fragmented landscape. So you have a higher dispersal mortality rate where you have higher fragmentation of habitat. So that's a negative effect of fragmentation. But at the same time, you have a higher likelihood of successful movement between patches, leading to a higher rate of colonization because the patches in the more fragmented landscape are closer together. So you have a higher rate of colonization with higher fragmentation. So like the dispersal ability question, we have this two-edged sword to habitat fragmentation where the effects can be, the effects through movement can be positive or negative. And so I think that probably leads to this mixing of results. But overall, the results do not strongly support this expectation that fragmentation of habitat independent of habitat loss should reduce biodiversity. So the third expectation is that habitat fragmentation by roads should strongly impact wildlife populations. So we know that roads reduce wildlife populations. We've done a couple of reviews, literature reviews on this, and overall you find that in about 2/3 of the cases, there are negative effects of roads or traffic on abundances or occurrences of species of wildlife. So roads definitely do have a negative effect on wildlife populations. This shows some examples of the different species showing negative responses to roads or traffic, whose populations show negative responses to roads or traffic. So there are at least 3 major ways that roads could reduce populations. One is directly by killing animals on the roads, so that's road mortality. The second is by disturbance, so for example, traffic noise. And then the third is the idea that roads fragment populations. So what is the idea here? So now we've put a couple of roads through this metapopulation, and the idea is that if roads fragment the population, then it's because individuals can't cross the roads. So you behaviorally probably they avoid going onto the road, and so the road represents a barrier to movement for that population. And so just as for the weak disperser example that I talked about earlier, if the dispersers can't get across the road, then they're not going to recolonize the patches as they go extinct. And so extinctions will accumulate in the landscape. So this is the idea, or one of the main ideas for why fragmentation by roads should reduce population abundance and persistence and occurrence. All right, so Fernanda, whom you know, Fernanda Tejera, who was a postdoc in my lab for a little while, did a search on this topic. And so she looked for all the papers that were about roads or traffic and on animals and effects. And so what we were interested in was seeing whether we could figure out which of these three mechanisms, fragmentation of roads, the roadkill, and the disturbance by roads, kind of compare their relative effects, and especially in the context of what I'm talking about today, to ask how strong is the fragmentation effect compared to the other effects. So she collected a lot of different road effects, and what we had hoped to do was to take all those studies, look at what people actually measured and what results they got, and take all of those results and split them into evidence for fragmentation effect, a road mortality effect, or a disturbance effect. So that was what we were hoping to do, but it turned out that most of the results, if you just look through what people measured and thought about what inference you could make about how roads affect populations, in most cases, the results were actually consistent with all three mechanisms. So it wasn't possible to take the results from individual studies and make inferences about particular mechanisms. So just to give you an example of that problem, one of the most common, possibly the most common things people measured was population abundance or occurrence. So I'll just, and there's three ways that people measure population abundance in response to roads. One is by doing transects, so away from the road. So if you find more individuals farther from the road than close to the road, then that's interpreted as an effect of the road on the population. Or the second way is to compare roads with different traffic levels. And if you have more individuals near the road with less traffic, then that's a road effect on population abundance. And the third way is to measure the abundance or occurrence in patches of habitat situated within landscapes with more roads or fewer roads. So if you have more individuals in patches in a landscape with fewer roads than more roads, then that would be an impact, evidence of an impact of the roads on abundance. So most researchers, when they get this type of results, they interpret these patterns as evidence for disturbance, that the road traffic noise or whatever is a disturbance, and so the animals are avoiding the road. But it's easy to see that any of these patterns could also be due to mortality. So if there's higher mortality around a road, then that's going to reduce the population there. And also, in fact, any of these patterns could be due to fragmentation or the road barrier effect. If animals cannot access the habitat because of the roads or the traffic, then the habitat will be less full. So that would be a fragmentation effect of roads. So the pattern that people are measuring does not allow an inference about the mechanism that's causing reductions in abundance. Okay, so as I said, most results are consistent with all three of the mechanisms, but interestingly, Fernanda also found that most of the authors actually inferred only one of the mechanisms. So so then we can get back to this question about fragmentation and the expectation about fragmentation. Because when both mortality and fragmentation were consistent with the results, authors inferred fragmentation more than 5 times as often as they inferred mortality. So that is an indication that that there's an expectation out there that fragmentation has a strong effect, so that fragmentation by roads strongly impacts wildlife populations. Even the expectation is even stronger than mortality, roadkill. So as I said, the evidence is all kind of very difficult to separate. It's very difficult to separate these different mechanisms. It's really hard actually just to design a study that does separate these mechanisms. But I do have an argument that would suggest that, in fact, road mortality has a greater effect than fragmentation on populations. So it only has two steps to it. So the first one is the first step is to identify the species whose populations are most reduced by roads, and then to ask, for those species, is mortality, roadkill, or fragmentation by roads a more likely cause of road impacts on those species given their traits? So what species populations are most reduced by roads? A former postdoc in my lab, Trina Ritwinski, did a meta-analysis on this. So she looked at all of the studies relating population abundance or occurrence to roads. And in most cases, the response was negative. However, the response was really negative for amphibians and reptiles. So amphibians and reptiles have much more consistent negative responses. Their populations have much more consistent negative responses to roads than birds or mammals. So that's a group of species that's particularly sensitive to roads. And then the other group whose populations are sensitive to roads are mammals with low reproductive rates. So the answer to the first part of this is that reptiles, amphibians, and mammals with low reproductive rates are the groups of species that are whose populations are most reduced by roads. So then we can look at the traits of those groups of species to ask whether roads are more likely to affect those sensitive species through a fragmentation effect or through a mortality effect. So if we consider the amphibians and reptiles, evidence suggests that they have very little avoidance of roads or traffic. So in general, they're not showing the barrier effect of the roads. However, when they do go on the road, they have essentially no avoidance of oncoming vehicles. In some cases, they actually freeze when a vehicle arrives, which increases their chance of getting killed. And they also, many of them have very low rates of movement when they go across the road. So they're highly susceptible to road mortality. So much more susceptible to road mortality than to the fragmentation effect of roads in general. And then for the mammals with low reproductive rates, the importance of the low reproductive rate in terms of predicting the responses of their populations to roads suggests that mortality is important because with low reproductive rate, they are less able to recover from mortality, from roadkill. So this is an argument and based on this indirect evidence, but it seems that the species whose populations are most reduced by roads are more likely, the mechanism by which roads reduce those populations is more likely to be mortality than fragmentation. So then, how does this work, or what does this look like in terms of that metapopulation diagram? So essentially what it's saying is that instead of a metapopulation with extinctions and colonizations, what we have is a road mortality effect that reduces the overall population size in the region. So I'm drawing that here as a fading out of the green in the patches. So as roadkill affects the population overall in the region or the landscape drops. And so, of course, you observe then when the population is smaller, you observe less roadkill and also less movement because the population is smaller. So it just becomes smaller and smaller. So it's an overall effect of mortality on the total population in the region. Okay, so There is more work that needs to be done looking at the mechanisms. As I said, it's hard to do for the road effects, but so far at least, the evidence is not strong for this expectation that habitat fragmentation by roads strongly impacts wildlife populations. It's stronger, I would argue that it's stronger for an impact, the evidence is stronger for an impact of road mortality or roadkill. Okay, so implications. First, I'm going to talk about the implications for conservation decision-making, and then I'm going to talk about the role of dispersal in conservation. So the first conclusion is that dispersal ability does not reliably predict sensitivity to land use intensification. So the implication of that is that conservation decision-making should not prioritize weak dispersers over strong dispersers, which is something that people often argue for. The second conclusion is that habitat fragmentation independent of habitat loss does not generally reduce biodiversity. So the implication of that is that conservation decision-making should maximize total habitat amount, irrespective of patch sizes, and that ecoregions and habitat types with low habitat amount should be prioritized for habitat protection, even if the remaining patches are small. So to go back to this example of southern Ontario, in this region, we have maybe 10 or 15% of the forest is remaining. And so this region should be prioritized for conservation and protection of the remaining habitat, even though that habitat exists only in these small patches, because the cumulative value for conservation of these small patches is high. And that also suggests, the other implication of that is that local small-scale conservation efforts can have high cumulative value. So in a region like that where you have a lot of people living, people will often become attached to particular natural spaces. And so the accumulated efforts of people to conserve those spaces has high value, and we should not suggest that it has low value just because the individual patches that they're attempting to save are small. And then the third conclusion is that habitat fragmentation by roads has less of an impact on wildlife populations than road mortality. So what that suggests, the inference from that is that keeping animals off of roads is more important than helping them to cross roads. So the way that people try to help them get across roads is through these things called eco-passages. So green bridges and and various underpasses. So the idea is to add sort of structural connectivity, to use the jargon, to the landscape and allow animals to move across the roads. But what the results suggest is that it's more important to keep the animals off of the roads. And we have, I didn't talk about it, but we have another meta-analysis that Trina Reitwinski is the first author on, showing that in fact these eco-passages do not reduce, by themselves, do not reduce road mortality. So you need to have some kind of structures that keep animals off the roads, and they should be structures that are effective for the species groups that are most affected by roads. So that's the amphibians and reptiles and the large mammals with low reproductive rates. So those are the conservation implications of what I've been talking about. So I just want to end by coming back to this question of the role of dispersal in conservation. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to build a diagram. And so in the diagram, green boxes indicate positive effects on population persistence. Red boxes indicate negative effects, and yellow boxes indicate mixed effects on population persistence. Thick arrows are strong evidence, and thin arrows are weak evidence. So we start down here with habitat amount. So the more habitat, the larger the population can be, and the larger the population is, the more likely it is to persist. So all else being equal, if you double the amount of habitat, then the population size can double, and that will increase its persistence. So that is a strong effect. We also have evidence that mortality, direct mortality, has a strong effect on population persistence. So if you have a very hostile matrix with, say, a road or pesticides, something that actually kills individuals when they go out there, then this is going to have a very large effect on population size, because it adds to the total mortality on the population. We also have structural connectivity, which should increase colonization, and that will have a positive effect on population size. And we have the number of emigrants. So this is the number of individuals leaving habitat patches. The number of emigrants has this two-edged sword effect, like I said before. So it will increase the colonization because you have more emigrants, but it will also increase the number of individuals in the overall landscape population that end up dying because they don't make it to more habitat. Similarly, when dispersal ability is measured as dispersal rate, that's equivalent to measuring it as the number of emigrants. So dispersal ability measured as dispersal rate has a mixed effect. It increases colonization, but it also increases dispersal mortality. Habitat fragmentation also increases the number of emigrants because you have more edge in a more fragmented landscape. So again, has a mixed effect by increasing the colonization, but also by increasing dispersal mortality. And at the same time, habitat fragmentation increases structural connectivity of the landscape, because for a given number, a given amount of habitat, if it's more fragmented, then the patches are closer together. So the success rate moving between patches increases. And then when dispersal ability is measured as dispersal distance, then that will increase colonization and immigration and increase population size. So all of this shaded area goes through this colonization or immigration box. And this is all of this area has relatively weak evidence compared to the evidence for the effects of just mortality in the matrix and the amount of habitat. But a lot of our conservation decisions have been emphasizing this portion of the diagram that goes through colonization. And I think that this relates, just to go back to the beginning, this relates to our emphasis on the metapopulation concept. And so what I would kind of conclude as a very final statement is that I think that the metapopulation concept has, over the past few decades, has led us to overestimate the role of dispersal in conservation. Compared to, I mean, there is a role of dispersal in conservation, but I think we've weighted it compared to the importance of mortality and habitat amount. So that's the end of my talk. So I don't know what I guess I undo full screen. And then
I'm back here.
Okay.
So
okay.
I removed your screen, so
okay.
Now people can see both of us.
Okay.
So thank you so much, Lenore, for your talk. It was great to see all this compilation of evidence and mix the results. So now we can move on to the discussion.
Yeah, sorry, Fernanda. I think I spoke a little bit longer than I thought I would. I think I was trying to speak slowly. So
No, there's no problem. That's the amount of time that we expected. So
okay.
now we have, we'll keep to half an hour of questions. So we'll not go further than that. I will start here with the questions. There are a lot of good mornings for you before and for all of us, and then some greetings and some people thanking you for your talk. So I will start here with the first question from Jefferson Bugoni. I will put it on the screen so you can also see. So he thanked you for your amazingly thoughtful presentation. And then he said, regarding the first expectation, I'm wondering whether you have also explored how dependent upon taxa identity is the relationship between dispersal ability and land use intensification.
Yes, we did that. Now I'm going to, can I take a minute to bring up the paper? Because
Sure.
I can't remember how it went, but so, and I only showed you a small bit of that. That paper is still not published. Let me just hang on here.
Take your time.
Okay. Let's see if it will. I just have to find the figure.
So we are okay. We are seeing your PowerPoint screen. So
you're seeing my PowerPoint screen, not my
not the whole screen. Yeah.
Okay. So okay, so the species group, okay. Yeah, so the species group for which weak dispersers were most likely to be most sensitive to land use intensification were the herptiles, so the amphibians and reptiles. And then arthropods were also more than average, likely to show that weak dispersers were more sensitive. And at the other end, birds and mammals were more likely to show that strong dispersers were more sensitive.
Okay. Thank you. So Jefferson, if you have any further comments, please on this, please put there on YouTube, then we can see here. Otherwise, I will move on to the next question from Valerio Pilar. So it's a comment. So he says that roads may also offer more resources, thus attract more individuals depending on the preferred diet. So grain leakages from trucks and dead animals.
Yeah, so that's one of the potential risks, I guess, of roads, is that if they are attractive to some species groups, then especially if they have high traffic volume, then you're increasing the risk of mortality on those roads by attracting them. So that's the idea, that roads can sometimes be an attractive sink. So so the wildlife is attracted to the road, and then they get killed on the road.
So, Jefferson had another comment here, but it was so he was complementing the question before you answered. So he was wondering if specific groups account for the presence or lack of effect. I think you already commented on it. Okay, so now we have a question from Karen. Her question has two parts, so we'll just go over here and then show them. She wonders if there is evidence that the effect of habitat fragmentation, independent of habitat loss, becomes more important as total habitat loss increases.
No, yeah. So no, In the 2017 paper, I looked at the median habitat amount in all of the study, and no matter where you are on that a gradient from low habitat amount to high habitat amount, you still find most of the responses to fragmentation, most of the significant responses to fragmentation were positive. So there doesn't seem to be good evidence for that. I haven't collected up the studies, but there have been a few studies that actually seem to suggest the opposite, that fragmentation effects seem to be actually more important the more habitat, or more negative the more habitat you have in some cases. So there was a recent study by Putker et al., and they found negative fragmentation effects in tropical forests when you have high forest cover. So that was for measuring fragmentation as edge density, they didn't get that result if they measured fragmentation as the number of patches. But the general answer to the question is that no, there isn't evidence for that. That's a hypothesis that's been out there for a long time, but it really just doesn't have any support.
Okay, thank you. So Milton commented here about an interesting next step would be to check how these differential mortality risks affect seed dispersal, either frugivores or those just dispersing plants. And he suggested effects on vegetation could be significant.
Yep, I agree for sure. I wonder if I can pull up the paper. So I've been involved in a review paper that's currently.
You can share your screen again. So I will. You can go and share your screen. So share the paper if you want to show it on the screen.
So it's okay. I'll just. No, maybe I should. I'll see what the results were. But so Eliana Cazetta, who did it was like a sabbatical. She spent actually 2 years sabbatical in my lab. So we've ended up. I just want to see. So what we tried to do was look at the effect of habitat loss and fragmentation on seed, on the interaction, the interaction between seed dispersers and well, basically on frugivory. So on frugivory and seed dispersal. So this is a meta-analysis. Unfortunately, there are very few studies that separate out the effect of fragmentation from habitat loss. But we did find some overall effects. I'm not. Anyway, but it's true. Yes, I think I better just say that. Yeah, so we have actually looked into that a little bit, but there needs to be more work there. There's a few landscape scale studies, but most of the studies are sort of local scale, patch scale studies. So it becomes difficult to make inferences with those studies about at least about fragmentation effects, if that's of interest.
Thank you. So I will just let everyone know that if people can still write their questions or comment on previous answers. I'm seeing the comment here. So there's another question from Tamara. She asks if you expected incorporating, so I don't need to read it.
So I don't know about for the first one, but for the second one, I have looked at that. So in my 2017 review, I looked at the question. No, it wasn't in that paper. Sorry, it was in a paper that I published last year that was a review of just the SLOS studies, single large or several small studies. And so in that, I looked at the results of the studies as a function of how long ago the habitat had been removed and the patches had been created. So the idea would be that if fragmentation effects become stronger over time, then the longer ago that the patches had been created, the stronger, the more negative should be the fragmentation effect, and the more recent, the less negative should be the fragmentation effect if the patches were created recently. And I did not find evidence for that. In fact, the pattern was opposite to that prediction. There aren't a lot of studies. I think there's more work that could be done on that, but the pattern so far does not seem to support the idea that some people have suggested that the effect of fragmentation should increase over time.
Thank you. So she has another question. She's asking what conservation decision implications can this historical assessment have?
So conservation decision implications, I'm not really sure about historical. So I guess the conservation implications were all at the end of my talk. So I could bring that up again, I guess, or you could just, I could go back to that slide. Can I do that?
Yes,
okay.
I'll share your screen again.
Yeah, okay, so I'll just, let's see here. That's the easiest way to do it. There we go. So the darker blue text here are what I think the conservation implications are. So I guess I went over them pretty fast, but the first one is that we should not be prioritizing weak dispersers over strong dispersers when we make decision-making, conservation decision-making. We should be so we should, when we make conservation decisions for habitat protection, we should be aiming to protect as much habitat as possible and not be concerning ourselves about whether it's contained in small patches or large patches. And also, this means that ecoregions and types of habitat that currently have little habitat, we should be prioritizing those for protection, even if the remaining patches are small. So if we accumulate protection of many small patches, we'll still have a large positive effect on conservation. And then the road one was that we should be, when we're trying to mitigate the effects of roads, we should be concerning ourselves more with keeping animals off the roads than with trying to help them to get across them. So I don't know if that answers the question, but those were the ones that I quickly mentioned, at least in the presentation.
I think it does. Let's see. Feel free to ask more questions. So there is another comment here about restoration from Gerhard. He sees many implications for restoration, about restoring small sites.
Yes, right. Yeah, I mean, I think, for example, taking that landscape that I showed from southern Ontario, which is, only got 10 or 15% of the remaining in forest, then it's difficult because in those situations, often the remaining habitat is privately owned, so it takes a different kind of process, I guess, to protect that kind of habitat. But then at the same time, we could encourage people to set aside areas that and allow restoration, allow forests to be restored in places, and maybe not be so worried about whether it's a huge area that is being restored. But again, the accumulation of many actions like that should have a positive effect.
So he complements by asking if we can use this evidence related to the positive effects of fragmentation when designing restoration think it's a very interesting topic.
Yeah, I possibly, although I guess it depends partly too on the reason for the positive effects of fragmentation. So one of the when we're talking about species richness as the response, then it seems that a set of many small patches has high beta diversity. So you have large differences in which species are present between the patches, and that's what creates the high overall number of species. So in that case, I'm not sure that would replicate in the case of restoration. It might over time, though. There is this idea that another reason why you have more species in many small patches is that they will take different. If we're talking about forest, they might take different successional trajectories, the different patches, and so that will increase the difference among them in terms of which species are present. So if that's true, then yeah, you could potentially apply that to designing a restoration plan. If the restoration plan is for a particular species that you're concerned about, then then I'm not too sure. I think you just want to somehow try to maximize the amount of habitat. I think one thing is that I think one of the implications, which I didn't mention, is a practical implication, which is that different bits of habitat, potential habitat, or habitat that exists or that could be restored, are going to be more or less easy to actually restore because of whoever owns them, the decisions of the people in that particular place. And so one of the implications of all of this is that we should maybe look for the places where people are willing, and willing to kind of consider restoring or conserving habitat, and not worry about so much about whether that patch is going to be small or not, and accumulate, take advantage of the fact that some people are actually willing to be supportive of conservation, and not disregard the possibility of doing that conservation because the patch is too small. I'm thinking about I'm going to go on a little bit, but about a conversation I had with someone who works for the Canadian not Nature Federation. Anyway, what is it called? The big nature thing that protects habitat in the States. The Nature Conservancy. So the Nature Conservancy of Canada, and he was actually saying that when people kind of offer places that they would like to have set aside and cooperate with the Nature Conservancy to somehow put restrictions or on this habitat to keep it natural, that they consider whether it's a large enough patch. So they won't say yes unless this area is big enough. And I think that's a little bit counterproductive, because you have someone who's willing to do this, and I think it's worth it, even if it's a small area, because then that person has friends and neighbors, and they might talk about a little place that they would like to have set aside as well, and so then that accumulates to a large area, even though it's in small patches. So sorry, I went on a bit too long, probably beyond the question.
No, don't worry. This was great. It's great to see the relationship between different fields within ecology, and so we can go beyond. So there's another question here from Gustav about the non-existing effects of fragmentation.
Yeah, so this is essentially the same question that somebody else asked. So this is about the question of, over time, do you find negative effects of fragmentation? So over time, you find increasing negative effects of habitat loss, but you don't find increasing negative effects of habitat fragmentation. That's what the results show so far. So you do have an extinction debt. Like if you remove 50% of the habitat, then you'll remove some number of species immediately, and then over time there will be additional species losses. But whether you remove that habitat into a few small patches or many large patches, there won't be an additional extinction debt associated with the fragmentation itself.
Okay, so moving on to the next topic here on the question, we have one about functional traits from Julio.
So we've looked a little bit at that. So my argument about fragmentation versus roadkill effects is essentially based on traits of the organisms. So the literature, I would say that the literature. So if I think about the fragmentation literature, for example, it's not based on flagship. It's based. A lot of it is based on species that are easy to study. I mean, a lot of ecologists basically study things that they can study. So we tend to understudy threatened and endangered species because it's hard to sample them because they're rare by definition. So I don't think looking across the studies that we have a bias towards flagship groups. There's lots of studies of insects, for example, and plants. I'm not really too sure about the rest of the question. We didn't find taxonomic effects for the fragmentation. I didn't find taxonomic effects for the fragmentation results, so it doesn't. We still get mostly positive fragmentation effects irrespective of the taxon for the fragmentation results. Yeah, not sure. I could ask about a specific trait. I could tell you if we've looked at it.
And he asked another question just after that one. What's the role of habitat quality and community stability?
So the role of habitat quality, so that's a good question. Habitat quality, I always find habitat quality hard to differentiate somehow from habitat amount, because I think about habitat from the perspective of what is needed by a particular species or a particular group of species for them to persist. So if the quality of the habitat decreases from that species perspective, then there will be a period where maybe the reproductive rate is low or something, but then eventually it just turns into non-habitat, right? When the quality becomes so low, then it's turned in, it's essentially being turned into something that's not habitat for that species. So separating out habitat quality effects from habitat amount effects, I think is a bit challenging. And so maybe that's why, well, I think it just needs more work, but I don't think there's really been any comparison of the relative effects of declining habitat quality and fragmentation or patchiness. Yeah.
So there's another question from Elio, asking you to make a parallel on the concepts with this last debate and thinking of road mitigation measures. I think he's relating to roads. Yeah, he said, for example, several small passages versus single large passages.
Okay, yeah. So I think, possibly. I think that the thing about roads is if I'm correct that the most important thing is to reduce the mortality on the roads, then whatever is done, it's best done if it covers the whole road. So putting some kind of a barrier to keep the animals off the road along the entire road length, at least the whole length of road that passes through potential habitat for that species or species group. So if you have a lot of small passages, each of which is associated with a stretch of fencing, for example, then you might end up with nearly continuous coverage of the road by doing that. So you could infer that maybe that would be a better approach than having a big passage, and especially if the amount of fencing for amphibians and reptiles is minimal or non-existent, which it often is.
So there's another question about matrix hostility.
Yeah, so I think matrix hostility. There is a thing about matrix hostility that's also a little bit confusing because of the influence, I think, of least cost path analysis on this field, if you're familiar with that, which in the context of a hostile matrix essentially assumes that dispersers avoid going into places that are hostile. But the evidence doesn't actually support that very much. It more supports that if something is dispersing, then it will likely try to go through a hostile area. It might disperse more quickly through a hostile area, but the effect of increasing the hostility of the matrix is again to increase the mortality on the population. So the whole landscape population. So if the matrix is hostile, then it's not only the lack of successful immigration, but it's actually the effect of that mortality due to the lack of immigration. I mean, if you want to put it that way, but any individual that doesn't arrive at another bit of habitat, if that's the habitat it needs, then by definition it's died. So having a more hostile matrix increases that mortality on the total population in the landscape. And I guess what I'm suggesting is that effect of the hostile matrix on mortality has a bigger effect on the population persistence than the effect of the lack of immigration. They both have an effect, but the direct effect on the mortality, so therefore the direct effect on the population size, is a bigger effect than the indirect effect on immigration or colonization. But it's not to say that dispersal isn't important. Like I said, dispersal is, of course, important. I'm really just suggesting that we've maybe ignored some other things that are, or downplayed some other things that might be more important.
Great. So there's also a comment here from Pedro. His comment on the bias and saying that this is an interesting example of how cognitive bias and pet hypothesis can have a stronger effect on scientific conclusions. I'm going to comment on that.
Yeah, I mean, it's very, I think it's very pervasive, and I don't really know what we can do about it. There's been a lot of discussion of this type of thing recently. There's been evidence. It was a famous psychology paper a few years ago documenting this problem. But it is definitely there. This kind of bias, and it feeds itself because it makes it hard to publish papers that go against the bias. So then it tends to reinforce that view of things because the stuff doesn't get published. So, for example, of the papers that I talked about today, the review paper that Amanda Martin has written, that's the most recent one, and that's the one that hasn't been published yet. And we have had one rejection so far. But we know that it's going to be very hard to publish because we know that 88% of the people believe that weak dispersers are more sensitive than strong dispersers to land use intensification. So, based on the study itself, we know that 88% of the reviewers approximately are going to have that expectation, and so not be very receptive to the opposite. So yeah, it's definitely a challenge. It took us a few years. I don't, Fernanda, you probably remember how many journals we tried. Just even
3 or 4, I think 4.
Yeah. So you have to be pretty persistent. Like to say this type of thing does take some persistence for sure.
On the same subject, I have a question. If you have any advice for thinking, especially on the, I know we have a broader public on the seminar, but thinking about graduate students that are working or sometimes in the beginning of their careers, some advice to how to look at this cognitive bias issue in their own research.
Right. Yeah. So I've been focusing a lot recently with this is an undergraduate course that I teach in landscape ecology on really trying to encourage students to do systematic reviews of whatever topic it is. So do an unbiased review, set out a plan for the literature review and make decisions in as unbiased a way as possible. I mean, how, you did that for your review. It's hard, like for a topic that broad, it takes a long time. So you won't be able to do that process for every single statement in a paper, in the introduction of a paper that you make. But to the extent possible, to really try to, when you're making a statement in a paper, to try to question the evidence, like each time, question the evidence, and just to see whether that statement is actually supported by the evidence. But then it takes longer for sure to write papers. So you might be in a better position to do that later on in your career in a way, right? Because there is this thing, if you're a graduate student, you do have to get the papers published and everything. So there's it's a bit tricky, I would say, at that stage. Yeah.
But I think that at least we are talking about it and thinking over this topic. So I hope people can at least question themselves. So we have 2 more or 3 questions. So before we can finish, one from Isis.
So I guess the reviews that we've done, we didn't limit it to large or small animals or whatever. So it does cover a very large range. And when I did the 2017 paper, I was thinking about this question of body size and large animals in particular. So people thinking that habitat fragmentation should have an effect on larger animals that need more habitat. They need more habitat, but does that habitat need to be contiguous, so unfragmented? That's really the question. So I did that. I kind of looked at that. I tried to look at that kind of in an indirect way in that paper by looking at the sizes of the landscapes that the authors used. So my thought was that if you're looking at habitat fragmentation for something larger that moves around more, then you're going to choose a landscape size that will be larger than if you're looking at habitat fragmentation effects on something smaller that doesn't move as much. And I didn't get an effect, a difference. So the majority of the fragmentation effects were positive, irrespective of the landscape size, and they really varied. Like, they varied over 4 or 5 orders of magnitude. It was huge variation in the landscape size across the studies. So it's, the question though is, it's kind of tricky because there are some cases where you can't really do the study because you don't have you really don't have multiple landscapes, in a sense. If you have a species that's really wide ranging, then it may have one population globally, and so it's really then just a matter of, well, in my view, it's just a matter of maintaining the habitat that it needs, the amount of habitat that it needs, but asking the question whether that amount of habitat has to be contiguous or not becomes impossible for something that's really really big. But anyway, that's
it's great to think about the limitations of the study designs. So here a question from Ismael about a confounding factor of habitat.
Edge effects, yeah. I'm surprised that hasn't come up yet. So yeah, that's true, and I think that's a potential situation where fragmentation effects could be negative or positive, depending on whether edge effects are negative or positive. We have to, what hasn't been done, so this is a study that needs to be done if anybody wants to do this type of thing. But what hasn't been done is to take the studies that show negative or positive edge effects. So these are like local studies showing that there's more individuals or fewer individuals at the edge than the interior, and then asking whether the studies that show negative edge effects also show negative fragmentation effects, and the studies that show positive edge effects also show positive fragmentation effects. So in other words, can we extrapolate from that local edge effect to a landscape effect? And it's not obvious that you can do that extrapolation, because there are lots of other mechanisms at a landscape scale that might outweigh the edge effect. For example, predator-prey interactions might be affected by fragmentation, or connectivity, like I was talking about, how connectivity can increase with fragmentation. So you can't automatically go from a local observation of a negative edge effect, to conclude that fragmentation would have negative effects, or if it's a positive edge effect, that it would have positive fragmentation, that would have positive effects. So it would be I think that's a step that needs to be taken, basically, is to try to link those two things together. I don't know if there's enough data like, there's lots of edge effect studies, but how many of those there are actually studies at a landscape scale looking at multiple landscapes with different levels of fragmentation, I don't know. Like, it would require a review, so it would take a bit of time for sure. But I think it would be worth doing.
Lenore, we have 2 more questions. I don't know if you mind staying longer. It's okay.
Okay, yeah.
It's interesting. The debate is interesting. So one from Tatiana, asking your opinion about habitat corridors.
Hi, Tatiana. So habitat corridors. So I think we don't know. So I think the thing about habitat corridors is that they are habitat. So they add habitat to the landscape. And so we don't have very many studies, if any, that really look at the effects of corridors or connectivity, that kind of structural connectivity, independent of just the additional habitat that's provided. Because so normally the response that we're looking at is occurrence of the species, or species richness again, or abundance. And in that case, that can increase just by increasing the amount of habitat. So the fact that it's in a corridor shape versus not in a corridor shape is the question, right? If you add that habitat, does it matter that it's actually a corridor as opposed to a blob? And so there aren't very many studies like that. I have 3 students who have done a study like that last summer. We don't have their results yet, but they did a selection of landscapes to try to get independent gradients of forest amount, forest fragmentation, so number of patches, and connectivity. So that would be, in that case, it's hedgerows connecting forest patches. So it's going to be interesting to see what they get. So they're including the hedgerows as habitat, as part of the habitat, the woody hedgerows as part of the habitat in the calculation of habitat amount. So controlling for that. Yeah, so we'll see what happens. But I think that it's one of those things, the corridor question, it's one of those things that's been confounded for a long time, as was habitat fragmentation with habitat amount. So it's hard to answer the question. I think it's an important one because it goes back to this question about where should we prioritize habitat protection? So if the habitat is in a corridor, should we give it higher protection than habitat that's not in a corridor? Well, but what if it's easier? What if the people that own the habitat that's not in a corridor are more willing to, allow it to be protected than the people that own the habitat that's in a corridor? Should we still be saying no to the people that have the habitat that's not in a corridor because we think corridors are so important? So it's important to know the answer to that kind of question. Just to blather on a bit more, one of the things that has sort of has kind of appeared, I guess, over the last few years for larger animals, now that we have a lot more data on tracking of larger animals. The studies generally don't show them following corridors when they disperse. So corridors of like structural connections in that, like the same kind of habitat as they're, breeding in, for example, that they would travel through those corridors. They show animals traveling through all kinds of different cover types, usually, often at night. And so the idea that you need to have these structural connections to allow movement is, I think, a bit up for grabs at this point. It may be, all right, I'm not going to go on. That's it.
I can go on. So we're going to our last question about capturability.
Capturability, more easily captured in smaller fragments. Yeah, I don't know. I mean, the diversity of different study types. Most of the bird studies are based on song, so listening to song. Not actually capturing the animals. I don't. So I guess a lot of the insect studies would be based on capturing insects. I don't know if that's more likely in a small patch than a large patch. Plants are just surveyed in quadrats and stuff like that. Mammals, I guess, a lot of times these days people are using camera trapping for larger animals. For small animals, we use footprint tracking tubes. So we don't actually capture the animals. We just let them run through the tubes and they leave their footprints. So I would say overall, like, yeah. First of all, there's probably not that many studies that are actually capturing animals when doing their surveys. You know, bats also, you can do bat recorders. And then for those that are capturing animals, are they easier to capture in small patches? I don't know. I don't know why they would be, but I guess it's possible.
Okay, so this was our last question. I won't show here because of the time, but we have many people thanking you for the presentation and for the answers as well. We had more than 200 people
Oh, wow.
watching your talk, and it will be on YouTube available afterwards if other people want to see. I want to thank you very much for being here and having this productive discussion with us about your results. I think one issue maybe to highlight, you mentioned again, answering one of the questions, is that part of the results that you presented are not published yet, right? It's submitted, so people can wait and hopefully soon they can read all the papers if they want. Don't know if you want to say anything else before we finish. I just want to highlight that below here we are sharing the next seminar that will be in April 13th with Dr. Alan Anderson from Charles Darwin University from Australia, talking about the response of ant communities to disturbance.
Cool.
So, Lenore, thank you very much for being here.
Thank you, Fernanda. Thank you, everybody, for coming. It's fun.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone, for attending our talk.